So we are going to talk now about a way to learn openings. This is the method that I use myself and the method that I pass on to my students and have them use from a pretty early rating level. There are a few different steps to it. There's a phase. There's two parts where you're gathering your own ideas. The first part of gathering your own ideas is thinking about an opening from like the very beginning logically, very like broad strokes. The second part is playing some speed games. So those two parts, you're gathering your own ideas. The third part is gathering other people's ideas. So in the third part, you're going to look over Grandmaster games in your opening. And then there comes a long iterative process of analysis where you look more precisely at opening ideas of yours and of Grandmasters that you like. So that's the overview of the method. A lot of times I have my students stop after the third part, so I don't make them do like the analyzing. That's partly because, like, you know, a lower rated player won't be very good at analysis. And it's also like, let's say you have, 20 hours to learn a new opening. You may never get to the fourth step, which is fine. Okay, so let's go through the 4 steps and you'll see what I mean. The one that's probably hardest for you to imagine what I'm talking about is the first one, which is to look at the position and think in sort of like a deep strategic way. And I'm trying to scan the chat to catch important questions on this, but I'm also going to try and like deliver the main idea with correct words that you can understand. So we'll see how we do with that. All right. So here's one of the first examples I like to give my students. Let's say you see this move 1b3. When you see the move 1b3 and let's say you're setting out to come up with a defense for black against 1b3. You see this move. The first thing you want to do is you want to think logically about 1b3. What are the strengths and weaknesses of this move? What does this move like tell you about how the game's going to develop from here, etc.? So here's like a first test for all of you that you can play along with me on. Once white plays 1b3, what does that tell you about where white's other pieces are going to go? What does that tell you about their plan? What are they trying to set up or do or control? What does it tell you about some of their other pieces? So I'm going to do a little didactic pause here to give everyone a chance to think for themselves, because that is the crux of my opening method. Thank you, Z Nation. You're like my first forum helper or chat room helper. That was a very precise summary. All right, so someone's saying, I think the bishop will go to g5. That person's probably joking, right? This bishop going to g5, b3 would not probably be the way to do that. The bishop wants to go to b2. Someone else says yes. Clearly, the idea of b3 is to prepare a 4. We got 2 jokes and 1 real answer so far. No, I'm scanning through it. Let's see. Take a grip of d4 and fight for e5. Absolutely. So d4 and e5. So he wants dark square control. Yep. He's trying to get dark square control. He wants to control this long diagonal. It makes sense that if he's going to put the bishop there, he's going to want to try and keep that diagonal open and control it and keep that a really good piece, as some people are saying. All right. And someone else is already saying, hey, we want to play e5 to block this diagonal, potentially. But you're jumping the gun a little bit by already starting to say what you want to do as black after only figuring out that white's trying to play bishop b2 and control his diagonal. I'd like us to think a little bit more deeply about what this move tells us about white's pieces, because it tells us more than just the bishop coming to b2. So, to make my point, from the starting position, there's probably a certain % chance that the knight develops to a3, c3, or d2, right? Across like any possible configuration of openings, right? So it's something like there's a 7% chance it goes to a3, or maybe 9% chance, whatever, you know, and a 70% chance it goes to c3, and a 20% chance it goes to d2, or something like that, right? Same for every piece that, you know, if you look through a database, there'd be statistics about where those pieces tend to go. So once somebody plays b3, what does that tell you about where this knight is likely to go? Well, let's see if anyone has an answer now. Somebody is pumped about knight a3. The odds of knight a3 have increased. So, yay, knight a3. That is correct. Okay. So, what you can say here is that if white is planning to play bishop b2 and control this diagonal, the odds of white playing knight c3 have just diminished greatly. Because, as you know from fianchetto openings, if you have a knight on c3 or f3 blocking your fianchettoed bishop, you tend to have to move that piece again to finish developing your piece, right? So if we know the bishop's going to b2, it's like less likely that white's going to play knight c3, right? This means a stronger chance of knight d2 and a stronger chance of knight a3. Very good. So now you're starting to see the idea, right? Well, what else can you read from b3? How has it affected other pieces of white's? Does it affect the d pawn? Where's the d pawn going to go if I want to play bishop b2 and then either like knight a3 or knight d2? Where's my d pawn going? Where's my bishop going? Where's my knight going? You can tell me something about all four of these pieces, I think. The knight, the pawn, both knights, the d pawn, and the bishop. Just off of this one move, b3. Makes it more likely the d pawn stays home, in which case knight 2 would be less likely. But on the other hand, you don't want to block the bishop, and the d pawn probably still needs to move. Okay. Yes. It's a good answer. The idea of b3 is b3, e5, bishop b2, knight c6, e3, knight f6, bishop b5. Because white has played knight a3, he's better. Yeah. All right. Okay, so we've got one person saying the d pawn probably wants to go to d3 so as not to block the diagonal on d4 and allow the knight to come to d2 probably, right? Especially doesn't want to go to d4 where it would make the bishop b2 bite on granite. d3 looks weird too. Yeah, you're right, Super Bueb. d3 also looks weird even though we're kind of starting to conclude that that is kind of like the likely square for this pawn. Why does d3 look weird? It looks weird because after this, you've got all these pawns in a row on light squares in this whole area, which means your dark squares could potentially be weak, and your pawn structure might not be so flexible, and you'll really rely on this dark squared bishop, right? Yeah, so people saying you won't play d4 are mostly right, but there's actually an important exception to that. What would be the exception to when white will play d4? Yeah, d3 looks weird, but is logical, someone says, and someone else had the right answer, that it weakens the dark squares on the queen side. Does anyone know when you would play d4? The answer is if your opponent has played either c5 or e5. You will play d4 as white if you think that the d4 pawn will just get traded very quickly, right? Then it's fine to play d4. You don't want to play d4 if it's just going to block your bishop. So if I play for black like here, here, here as an example, it's very unlikely that right now white's going to play d4, right? We're all agreed on that. But as another option, let's say I play here, bishop b2, d6. In this position, the move d4 is totally plausible for white. And we could throw in some other moves first, but just as like a very quick example, right? This move could make plenty of sense in general, because if they take, your bishop is open, right? And if they push past, you can do this, and you've actually gotten rid of the pawn on e5 that was blocking your bishop. Make sense? So yeah, I mean, there could be situations where you wouldn't want to trade your d pawn for a c pawn. Certainly, there are positions where you don't want to make this trade, but there are positions where you do. It really depends. But in general, if there's going to be a pawn trade, then d4 becomes a very plausible move for white. If there isn't going to be a pawn trade, then the pawn may likely go to d3. And if you don't want to play d3 and weaken your dark squares, then the knight might be going to a3 instead of d2. And that, I mean, you should definitely look for opportunities to play knight a3 in this b3 opening, because they can really work out nicely for you, because then you don't have to move your d pawn. The only reason to play d3 is to play knight d2. So if you can develop your knight this way, then you can save yourself a move on the d pawn and leave it on d2 where it's better. All right, and I'll just say that if you're trying to control these two squares, it's more likely that you're going to play knight f3 than knight h3 or knight e2. Knight f3 is the most likely move in general throughout chess for this knight, but the odds have just gone from, like, 68% to like 85%. It's really going up. And it also tells you something important about this bishop. The main thing it tells you is that this bishop is very unlikely to go to c4. That's the square that, like, dips in percentage right away as soon as someone plays b3. Because in general, a bishop on c4 is very, like, exposed to moves like b5 and d5, etc. It's a long-range piece that likes to be tucked away if possible. So once you've got this, like, light squared pawn structure here, this bishop can't be tucked away if we bring it out to b5 or c4. So the odds of bishop c4 and bishop b5 seem to have gone down, with an exception. If your opponent puts their knight on c6, then to fight for control of these two squares, it might make sense to quickly play bishop b5 with the intention of trading it off. But unlike the Ruy Lopez, there's no way you're doing one of these bishop a4, bishop b3, bishop c2, bishop b3, bishop a2, bishop b1, bishop c2 maneuvers, right? So, as soon as you play b3, you've cut off a whole area of the board from being, like, not from being a green pasture for this bishop. So you see how a move like 1b3 immediately tells you a whole lot about what could be happening. And before sitting down with an opening book and starting to memorize a bunch of variations, or with a database, as is now perhaps done, or just hitting spacebar to see what the computer suggests you play as black here, I think it's really good to sit down and ask yourself, like, logically, like, what's going on here? What are my strengths and weaknesses? Where are my pieces going? Where are the opponent's pieces going, etc. Okay. Am I missing any questions here about this? No. Okay, I haven't missed any important question here. So b3. Yeah, so that's the kind of approach you want to take to, like, thinking about it. And now let's, like, translate it to, like, a real opening, like an opening that you might be more likely to face. So let's look at the French defense for a moment, because that is something that we are going to be playing a bunch today in our games. So we'll use this as an example. Let's say you wanted to learn a line in the French defense. The French defense starts out, well, okay. So when you see this position here already, you should already start thinking about, like, what's going on? What's important here? What's the tension? What are we fighting over? What's going on? Who's trying to take something? So there's a couple of different pawn structures that can arise out of this, but the first thing that we want to see is that black is challenging the e4 pawn. And what you should know in general is that if you play e4 openings, the e pawn tends to be undefended and weak because the king's here, but it's relatively easier to follow up with d4, taking over more of the center. If you start with d4, your d pawn is well protected and strong and hard for black to counterattack, but it's relatively harder for you to get control of e4 and build the full center that way. Okay, so we start with e4 here, and there's two good openings for black, which involve trying to control d4 and prevent you from freely setting up e4, d4. And there's two good openings for black, which revolve around counterattacking e4, and those are the Caro and the French. So in that sense, they're related. They both involve attacking this pawn immediately with the pawn and trying to force white to make some decision about the center. That's the premise of black's opening, is this attack on e4. White has, broadly speaking, 3 options to deal with that, right? They could advance at some point to avoid pawn trades. They could trade off on d5, or they could defend the pawn on e4. Do you guys have enough general chess strategic knowledge to know, to know what your preference should be between those 3 options? There's one of those 3 that you should look to do preferentially. And if it's not good, obviously you're willing to do any of the other options. It's okay to do the second or third option. But of advancing, trading, and defending, what should your general preference be in chess? All right. And we start off immediately with a correct answer. Okay. So the right answer is, in general, you want to defend things rather than trading or pushing in the center. Okay? And the basic reason is that trades tend to improve your position. So at a very simple level, if I'm able to play here and you trade and I trade, whose position has improved more in the last 2 moves? Right? If we've got 2 snapshots. You got this position, and then you've got this, right? White's position has improved more. Okay? Now, you could say that gaining space is advantageous as well. And that is true. Space is a nice advantage in chess. Very early in the game, you do want to be careful about wasting time on pawn moves in order to gain space. Okay? So I'll just throw that out there. You want to be a little bit careful about it. But, I mean, immediately it has a clear advantage. Like, your bishops have 2 open diagonals to develop, and your opponent's already had one of his blocked because of your extra space. Okay? And what you least want to do is trade yourself. You want your opponent to trade. So in general, you want to be recapturing in chess. Not capturing, but recapturing. Okay? Throughout chess. If you take, your opponent gets to recapture, and now their pieces are free. Okay. So here the first instinct would be something like knight c3 or knight d2. Those would tend to be better than bishop d3 or queen d3 because, in general, if you're talking about the e4 square and some trades happening, your knight is more likely to be well placed on e4 than your bishop or your queen. Right? Your bishop and queen are both longer range pieces that often like to be at a greater distance firing at something, and the knight needs to be in the thick of things. So knight c3 and knight d2 are kind of like the moves that you would first think would be white's best moves against the French. Now, another thing about the French defense is that, let's say I defend e4. What's black going to do? There's only 2 real moves here for black from like a grandmaster perspective. And those are knight f6 and bishop b4. What those 2 things have in common is that they both continue to threaten the e4 pawn. Okay? So a lot of chess openings revolve around a fight over one pair of central squares, either e4 d5 or d4 e5. Okay? So for example, the Ruy Lopez revolves around the other pair of squares, right? Right? Like move after move, the players are fighting for this pair of squares here. Okay? And the French is the opposite pair. In the French, the early battle is about this pair of squares. Consistently. Right? And so, oops. And so you see moves like knight f6 attacking these 2 squares, right? Maybe bishop g5, trying to control these two squares again. Bishop to b4, trying to control these two squares again, right? You see these same moves come up again and again. Absolutely, you can ask some questions here. I'm not going to answer off-topic questions until we get through with this segment. Okay, so if you ask me what's the best tactics book for a player rated 1372, that's at another time. And there are plenty of times when I'm happy to answer any question. But right now, I'd love to answer any questions you have about what I'm saying here to make sure you're understanding it. Okay, so fighting over that pair of squares. Similarly, bishop to b4 instead of knight f6. Also fighting over this pair of squares. Here, usually white. If white wants to keep fighting for this pair of squares, you might want to bring a knight here to back up that knight. And then if they take, you can go here, here, here. And you've temporarily sacked the pawn, but you're hoping to get something back for it. Or perhaps win it back immediately. However, after a bunch of calculation, a lot of people don't think that this variation is that good for white. Therefore, even though the preference is to maintain e4 and to fight for this pair of squares, after bishop to b4, most people think that white no longer has a satisfactory way to keep the tension on these two squares. The other option to knight e2 that would be a similar thing would be bishop d3. This would also be the kind of move that you should look at first here, before you look at e takes d5 and e5, which are always options 2 and 3. So bishop d3, and this move also somehow doesn't work out. Let me see if I can remember why. I don't think I'm going to remember why offhand, sorry. Black gets a tempo here. The bishop's on a nice square, though. I think this might be the key line. e5. Sacking a pawn, but surprisingly, black comes out very well. Yeah, that's the answer. Okay, because just real quick, here, take, here, here. All right, and black gets a a good position. Okay, the details don't matter that much, but I mean, I don't want you to remember all this stuff. Yeah, we've got 2.5 hours left on the broadcast. Okay, so, but what you see here is white has successfully defended e4 for now, but suddenly black gains one tempo off of the exposed bishop. Remember, we said knights are better here than bishops or queens. And then, having conceded the fight over d5 and e4, black suddenly switches the fight to the different center pair. And this happens in a ton of openings, so that's why I'm going to take a moment to point this out to you. Okay? I said that most openings revolve around a key pair of squares. And that often is the case between moves like 2 and 7 or 8 in a game. But what super often happens in chess openings is that at some point, the opponent, one player or other, switches the fight from one pair of squares to the other. So here, black has just conceded the fight for d5 and e4. He made the trade, he gave white control of the diagonal, and he suddenly switches to fighting for this square. Why? Well, white doesn't have knight f3 available anymore, right? So black suddenly switches their attention to the other pair of squares. Having traded their d-pawn means their queen is on d4. So in all those openings, you need to watch for black, starting to go after d4 again. And after knight e2, you see that black has completely switched to this other pair of squares here, right? And that explains, like, strategically what black's doing here. It doesn't guarantee that it would work or not, right? But it does happen to work. And given that, according to analysis and practice, knight e2 and bishop d3 both seem to be pretty fine for black, people have switched to looking at these two moves, right? Now, the preference in general, the second preference after supporting and defending your center, is going to be advancing to gain space rather than trading. Now, advancing to gain space can also fail, right? Like, your opponent could immediately undermine your center. It could all fall apart, and this variation could be bad. And if this variation were bad, then white would have to come back here and say, hey, I have to trade. And if he has to trade, then probably white would stop playing 3 knight c3, to be honest, because this is not a very satisfactory result. But realistically, like, If defending it doesn't work, if pushing it doesn't work, then you come to the third option, which is just trading off. Now, in general, the French defense has, whoops, sorry. It's hard to find my variations in here once they get all bunched up. Did I get it? All right. So what very often happens in the French is a very good example of an opening with a switching of key pairs. Almost every time after this fight for d5, e4, if white plays e5, the fight immediately switches to d4 and e5. And many of you probably already know this, even if you have limited experience playing the French yourself. As soon as white plays e5, black usually starts fighting against d4. And the reason they're fighting against d4 is because they're actually fighting for both of these pairs. It's just, it can be hard to take on e5 head on, right? But they're fighting for this pair of, but they're undermining they're attacking d4 to undermine e5. So they're really going after both squares. And, yeah. I had a game earlier today in one of our blitz games, which started with knight d2, right? And you guys saw this variation here. Here I played f6, but you're supposed to trade first, then f6. So you see, if you look at what black's done here, right? His knights are attacking these two squares. This pawn's attacking this square. And now he's even attacking it from f6. And you don't always attack it from f6, but I, on purpose, switched to this variation for a second to show you guys that you're really fighting for both of these squares at the same time. Let's see if there's any questions I'm missing. White usually attacks kingside, black attacks d4 square over and over. Where should we attack on? Yes, when you've got locked up centers with these kind of pawn chains, they do tend to dictate on which side of the board you're playing. So usually where white has the center advantage, you'd see white playing on the king side. But there is scope to fight back where your opponent is strong. So there's plenty of exceptions. And here you see is one variation where black plays f6 quickly, trying to break up this e5 pawn before white can castle and play f4. And then the variation usually goes like this. And so black has, minimized their disadvantage on the king side a little bit like this in exchange for a weakness here. Yeah, you can also play, there's a tactical line here, which is like knight f4 instead of taking on f6. And this is a good example of why it can be hard to, play on the side of the board where you're weaker, because after knight f4, you get something like here, 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 for example. So white just goes immediately on a big attack against black in the area where black was weaker at the moment. So there's always a risk in fighting back where your opponent's strong, but there are definitely situations that dictate doing so. Okay, so the pawn structure doesn't 100% tell you oh, this side is completely mine, white could never fight back, and this side is completely white's, I could never fight back. It's a little more complicated than that, but it does tend to tell you where you're likelier to win or lose, and you can, keep that under consideration as you go. Okay, so when you first look at the French defense, right, I want you to be thinking about all of these things, and you're thinking do I want to go knight c3 or knight d2? What's the upside of knight c3, upside of knight d2, right? Downside of knight c3 is largely that it allows this kind of bishop b4 move, which really takes your knight out of the fight for e4 and d5. So then you're probably going to lose the fight for e4 and d5 if you go knight c3, but you're going to get the bishop pair. So how do you feel about that trade, right? You can play knight d2, so now you'll probably be able to control e4 with knight d2 and bishop d3, etc. But with knight d2, you're losing your control over d4 by blocking your queen, and you're blocking your bishop. So if you're playing knight d2, you're imagining that the downside is going to be your opponent might be able to switch and counterattack a different pair of squares suddenly. And I think you can even see this kind of variation, like knight c6, switching to this, right? c3, e5. Ever seen anything like this? So black suddenly switches from fighting for these two squares to fighting for these two, right? Another rapid shift. This happens also in this opening famously. Not famously because nobody plays this. C3. So as I said, in E4, E5, knight F3, you're fighting over this pair of squares. Whoops, sorry, C3. Right, going for this. Now, in response to C3, trying to play D4, black's like, okay, after C3, I'm probably going to lose the fight for D4, but white can't play knight C3. Let me switch the fight to a different pair of squares. And so in almost all C3 openings, you'll see the counter from black be either D5 or knight F6, right? And so you go knight F6, and black's ready to play D5 next, or they can even play D5 right away because there's no knight C3 here. All right, back to the French. French it up. All right. So the first thing you want to do with like any opening that you're starting to learn is you want to like just think about it yourself and think about what you think is good. How good do you think E5 is in this position? You know, how much do you think black has a strong counterattack against D4 and E5, or how much do you think they're suffering from a space disadvantage and a bad bishop, right? Does playing knight C3 or knight D2 before playing E5, does that improve your chances or not, right? So another very, very important skill for any chess player is comparison. So basically, like, you're going to have an arsenal full of strategic ideas that you know when you're playing chess. But you're going to get position after position after position that's not a position that you studied at home, but that is like, it's like a position that you studied at home, but there's one thing different. Okay? So for example, you'll get the advanced French, but your opponent will have a pawn on H6 instead of H7. And then you have to ask yourself, does this make the position better or worse than me? Which of my plans does it make better or worse? Does it mean I still go for F4, F5, or do I now go for bishop D3, bishop C2, queen D3, right? Which of my plans is this improving or disimproving relative to the position that I do know, right? So you want to use that like comparative thinking all the time. So one question that I often ask my students, and I'm going to throw it in here for you, is I throw in these two moves to make sure it's a position they haven't seen before or thought about. And then I ask them, is this better or worse for white than the normal French defense? And does it change whether you would play knight C3 or knight D2 or E5 or take on D5? Right? So I'm not going to answer that one today because we have to keep moving. I've already given you guys a couple, but that's something that you can like try and work on. Send me your answer if you want. I don't know if streamers give out prizes. I'm not sure I have any prizes to give out yet, but if you give me a good answer for that, maybe I'll invent a prize for you, okay? So this is a good comparative question. Does H4, H5 help or hurt white compared to the normal French? And how would you play with these two moves thrown in, right? How does that change it? This kind of question is very relevant, even though you might think like it's like nonsense to see like this move H4 here. But the point is not that it would be played on move 3, but that this kind of move can come up. And the question is, how does it help or hurt you? Or a similar, and I'll show you like immediately a similar example. We're focused on the French today, but in this position, the bishop here, there is a variation that goes H4. The point is if black plays E6, their bishop's trapped by G4. And then black can play H5, preparing E6. So now basically, you have exactly like this kind of like advanced structure. And the question is, does H4, H5 help white or help black? You know, why and how does it affect the way you want to play? So this French defense question is not at all like outlandish or like fairyland. It's good training for you. Let's see, am I missing anything? My friendship is a prize for my viewers. Yes, but my friendship is already freely given, so I'm gonna have to give something more. Okay, H4, H5 probably helps white, one person thinks. So yeah, anyway, you can get into that a little bit. And then here's like a really hard one. This is one that people have been like puzzling for a long time, right? So compare this position here for a second, right? Let's say C5, C3. All right, take a picture of that in your head and hold on to it for 20 seconds because you're about to compare it. All right, do you remember your previous position? All right, so compare those two positions in your head, okay? Now, how would you pick which line you're going to play against the French defense if you're setting out to learn to play white against the French? You have to imagine that position, like I could play the advance, or I could play knight c3. You imagine these two positions and you ask yourself, what's good or bad about these two positions? Which one do I think is probably better? That's the one you're going to study. You're not going to study the one that's in a repertoire book by someone or other with like a bunch of like computer moves, whatever. Not my way. And I suggest not your way. What you're going to do is you're going to imagine this position, the other position. You're going to pick which one seems right to you, which one you think looks promising for white. And that's the one you're going to practice and learn about and get better at. All right. All right. Now I'm going to do like a quick aside before we move on to step 2. And I'm going to tell you why I think it's so important to do all this kind of like thinking. I mean, there's 2 big reasons why it's important to think about things for yourself like this. It's like pick which variation you're going to play yourself instead of just like picking something out of a hat or an opening book or asking me what opening I think you should play against the Najdorf. Like, should you play a4 or bishop e2 or bishop e3 or whatever? No, you need to pick that kind of thing yourself. There's 2 reasons. Number 1, this kind of thinking gives you a deeper strategic insight, which causes you to like play better. And wrestling with these ideas in itself and just the process of trying to figure out which of these positions is better for white or black, that process is making you stronger and making you better. And it's creating like knowledge that's actually yours. Whereas if you just ask me and I tell you, oh, like 6a4 is best against the Najdorf for blah, 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 blah reason, you're not going to remember the reason, man. You're just going to think I said blah, 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 which I didn't. I actually just gave you a very detailed explanation of why 6a4 is the best move against the Najdorf. But all you remember is blah, 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 blah. Whereas, if you yourself sat down and looked at the Najdorf and said, what's the crux of this position? What pair of squares are white and black fighting for in the Najdorf? e4 and d5. And what do I need to do about that? Oh, black's going to play b5, b4 to control those 2 squares. White's going to go g4, g5 to control those 2 squares. I have to play a4 to cut black off. That's the key to controlling e4. Just play a4 and move 6. If you make these conclusions yourself, you will remember them and you will get better from doing that. There's a second reason why it's really important to go through this process and like think for yourself. And that is energy. Your own interest and dedication to your own moves. If you're playing a move that I told you to make and something seems to go wrong, you're just going to be like, ugh, David fed me garbage. Like, why am I playing this stupid nonsense? I don't believe in this move. My position's stupid. Like, I don't understand what's supposed to happen here, right? But if you play a move because you thought it was a good move and now something bad happens to you in the game, what are you going to do? You're going to fight for your idea, right? I mean, unless there's some like real like quitter losers in this room. You have decided that this is good for white, that this winnower is good for white. You thought about the advance in the winnower, and you decided that you can kill black with this dark squared bishop. He looks humble now, but you know that you can get the upper hand with him. And something bad happens to you during the game. Well, you're going to fight for your bishop, right? You are going to fight for him, and you are going to try and defend your idea, and that is going to cause you to like play better as well. So, is that clear? Those are the 2 reasons why we try and do this thinking ourselves. 1, so that the knowledge that you accumulate is actually your own. You're more likely to recall it and be able to deploy it and use it, right? 2, you will have like a personal investment in the variations that you're playing, and you will play better because you're trying to defend your ideas. All right, so step 2 in learning an opening is super fun. I promise, way more fun than reading an opening book for the most part. I've read a couple enjoyable opening books even though I tend to dump on them as a whole, as a genre. So the second step is you just play a bunch of blitz games. Because look, if you try and plan out everything that's going to happen in the game after seeing 1B3, you could go like 10 hours down the roads of theory of where you think the pieces are going to go and what it should be, and finally you conclude that like the answer is like F6. That's the one move that'll really kill this bishop. And then you actually play a game with F6, and your opponent plays like E4, E5, bishop C4, and you're like, what? The bishop can't go here because there's a pawn on B3. And then you play this position a few times and you get killed. Okay? So you find that in practice, your idea was refuted like within a couple moves, right? So theory and practice need to mix together. You cannot reason everything out at this like big level all by yourself. But I think it's important to have that foundation, because also when you find out that that F6 thing didn't work, you find out that this F6 thing didn't work, it helps you go back and improve your theory, right? You had a strategy, something about your strategy and your theoretical understanding was wrong. Now you like adjust it based on your experience and you continue to get stronger strategically, because there is some reason why F6 is not a god move here, and you can figure it out. So you go to playing blitz games now, and you will practice your blitz game, your particular opening a bunch of times, and start to get practice and see which variations are actually working or not working for you. So returning to, let's say, like, whoa, this variation, sure. Let's go to something a little more practical, maybe bishop b4, let's see, e5, c5, takes. Okay. So you play this a bunch of times. Let's say like you start out playing like queen g4 because you're like, oh, the whole thing about this position is that g7 is weak and I can go after it, right? And then in the queen g4 lines, you don't do well. Then you can switch to like playing, I guess it's black's move here, right? So let's play knight e7. So let's say you like play queen g4 for a while and you like find that like, you know, it just doesn't work to attack g7. Then you can switch to some other opening. You say, okay, I'm prioritizing this diagonal. That's like what I really have here is this like unopposed dark squared bishop. And this is, you know, my next attempt. You're not going to find like the refutation for the winnower on your like, well, you could. You have like a 1 in 6 shot. You're not going to find you're unlikely to find the refutation for the winnower like on your very first shot in the very first variation that you try, right? So it makes sense to try out a few different ideas that seem plausible to you and start to hone in on which one's best. And very often when you look at a position like this, you won't have like an immediate instinct like, oh, the best move is queen g4. Very often you'll be like, huh, it could be knight f3. It could be bishop e2. It could be h4, h5. It could be queen g4. And you're not sure which one it is. So you try out a few different moves in order to gain that understanding. All right, so that's the second phase. You play a bunch of blitz games. We will be doing that today in a little bit. We will return to doing that. Oh, I see a long question, so I'm going to read it real quick here. I can't seem to figure out what I want to do. Okay, so the question is, sometimes he can't figure out which plan or which variation he should be doing. Or there's a variation that you want to play and you can't quite figure out the plans to back it up. One thing that he's tried doing is playing it from both sides, playing the same position from white and black. So like if you want to learn like what's the best way to play here as white, is it useful to play it as white and black? And the answer is, to that part, is yes, definitely. So that's a good one to be. That's a good one to be a good one to know, that you should be playing it for both sides. The second, and then the question is there anything else he can do? Yes. You could go to step 3, which is gathering other people's ideas. You won't be able to figure everything in chess out all by yourself. So very often, you're going to have recourse to the giant body of knowledge that the players who came before you have been creating for like 120 years, 130 years. I don't know when the body of knowledge started getting useful, but somewhere around there. So you can have recourse to that body of knowledge and like get some ideas from other people and level up from that. I mean, you can also, The very important thing in chess is also to have like discourse with people. So, so you want to like talk to someone else as well. Like the main thing I'm suggesting for the third step for gathering other people's ideas is playing blitz games, because that's always available to you. But like section 3.2 or step 3.b or whatever could be like talking to some other players about what they think is good. And that could be similar to like looking in an opening book, except I'm pretty cynical about opening books. I'd rather, like, if you're 1600, I'd rather talk to your like 1600 friend. If you're 1800, talk to your 1800 friend, whatever, you know. Or if you've got a coach, obviously that could be helpful. But talk to someone else and like tell them like what you're struggling with and see if they have any input for you on that. Very often people have, you know, different things that they understand or don't understand, and they can contribute something to your understanding of the position, even if they're like a little bit weaker than you or a little bit stronger or whatever. Yeah, books aren't interactive, and that's like a big problem there, right? Like if someone says, oh yeah, you should just do this, and you're like, I don't understand why, it's not really going to help. If you don't have friends, you should go work on that before you work on your opening, and then you can get back to working on your opening. So yeah, raise your hand if that's your problem. I'm serious. You want to get better at chess, go make some friends. It's not that hard either, because like a shared interest is like 90% of the way to a friendship, right? So just don't be a jerk and like talk to someone who has similar interests as you, and you've got a friend. Yeah, I don't think we're going to do a long stream lesson on how to make friends. But I'm serious that it's important. So yeah, so playing blitz games in your opening with white and with black, trying out a few different variations, and then also absolutely, if you have the opportunity, talk to some other players and get some of their ideas. Yeah, there's probably like some self-help books about how to get friends. But that might be as useful as an opening book, I don't know. And then step 4 is analysis. So once you've played a bunch of blitz games, you might, let's say you start out in this position with a list of candidate moves, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's put another move. 5 and 6. So you start out with a list of 6 candidate moves right here. You, off of your logical thinking, decide that there are 4 that seem interesting to you. So I'm going to cut this down a little bit. I'm going to take out knight h3 and bishop e2. Those 2 don't look as promising to you. But you still can't decide between the other 4. Which one is like the truth? So now you try out these 4 different variations in a series of blitz games. You play 20 games with each of them. Now you start to narrow it down. You're like, you know what? I really got the feeling that like queen g4 was really good, and that knight f3 is like the second best if there's something wrong with queen g4. So then you go to step 3, you look through grandmaster games with queen g4 and knight f3. You play through like, you know, a couple dozen of those games, which I guess I should show you how to do in a second here, but I don't think there's a database on here, is there? Coordinate study, chess coaches, watch, learn, community. Somebody in chat tell me if there's a database on Lichess. But otherwise, I need to go to a site that has a database and show you how to do that real quick. So you'll play through a bunch of GM games in these 2 variations, and you'll start to pick out like ideas that you really like. Like you think like, oh yeah, in the knight f3 variation, after queen a5, I really liked the queen d2 games more than the bishop d2 games. So I want to, you know, work on queen d2. There is an opening explorer here. Opening book, book symbol. Only advancer. Book icon, bottom left. Make sure to set it to master games. Oh, this thing here. Opening explorer and table base. All right, let's see what happens if I click on it. Whoa! All right. And does it have moves to play? Wow. The Chess Bible, top games. It looks like this is made up of blitz games, not tournament games. Because like VIT 2014, I mean, it's a good rating, but I don't think anybody goes by that name in FIDE rated tournaments. Click gear icon and select master games. All right. Give me a gear. Give me a gear. Sorry guys for this stuff. Show threat, no. Gear. Database, masters, yeah. 2 million OTB games of 2,200 plus players. Yes, that's what I'm looking for. Dude. Thank you. Just what I wanted. Oh, short. Timon. All right, this is how to do it. Man, you guys, this is hooked up. All right, so, so let's say like I want to look at like Queen D2 here for some reason. So like I click on a game. What happens? Load it, load it. Oh, that's just what I was hoping would happen. All right, so we click through the game relatively quickly. Rook B1 here played to prevent bishop to B5 possibly, right, on this move. Rook B1, preventing bishop B5, develops the bishop, castles the king, bishop E2, space. Interesting. Oh, I guess like C3 is hanging, so he doesn't have time to put his bishop on the diagonal he wants. Yeah, man, this is awesome. This is awesome. This thing's working pretty smooth. All right, so we got 95 anyway for white, and the bishop comes out of retirement. So now white's basically just going to try and crush black on this E file here, right? On these weaknesses here. Looking good. Haha, surprise. Trade for the bad bishop that defends a pawn that you want. There's this saying that, like, bad bishops defend good pawns, right? Which is used to explain why you sometimes trade off a bad bishop. But here it's a bad bishop defending a bad pawn, and white still does it, right? So the new saying that you guys could whip out if you're trying to make chess friends is bad bishops protect bad pawns. That's why I had to trade my queen for it. All right. So, ooh, white gets the diagonal he wanted. Sweet. Because the rook can't take because of bishop E6. Oh man, he's really piling on to this whole E6 story, huh? You guys like this position for white? This is so glorious. I dream of positions like this. And this part is the brutality part. This is tactics. Tacticos. Converting. Man. This game was really beastly by short. Jeez. Well, I could look at that game a few times. That was fun. But I'm going to see if I can figure out how to look through multiple games, because that's what you usually do. So the verdict of this game would be that white had a really good position, right? And basically, we can say that after black played f5 and white traded this position, short proved that it was a very nice position for white out of the opening here. All right, so let's see if I close this, if I can click on another one. Yep, short versus nogi. All right, so queen d2 again. So this time b6 is played instead of bishop d7, which I thought was maybe to play bishop b5, rook b1, stop that. So this time he goes here. How are you going to stop that? All right, so short fights for the light squares right away before this comes down. Queen trade. Black goes for the bishop trade. Whoa. All right, who has the advantage here? Well, if white could castle kingside, he'd probably have a bit of an advantage, but he can't. White's going to have to fight against this pawn pair and sort of like find a weakness there to get the advantage. He could try and get like the b file first. That'd be my first thought here, would be rook b1. Short castles queenside. All right, we just click through it, see what's going on. He's trading off his strong e pawn. This is odd. This is a very odd approach. I don't know what short was doing here, and I hate to be rude, but I wonder if he knew what he was doing here, and they agreed to a draw. All right, so yeah, this one I would say this position is interesting and merits further study, But then, like, this approach of playing e6, to me, it's horrible. It's like developing black's rook and trading your nice pawn. I don't know. Ooh, that's a good crack. All right, so, you know, you want to be drawing conclusions from the opening every time you're, like, playing through a game like this. I mean, you play through the whole game, get a sense of what it feels like, but then you want to be able to come back and sort of like ask yourself, like, okay, the result of the opening around move 10, 12, 13, was this promising? Was this something I would want to repeat? I alluded to the fact that the fourth step is analysis, and I said it's an optional step, but in the interests of moving along, let's do a little analysis on this position. Oh, I can't send this tweet again? All right. Try it like this. Tweeted it again. All right. So let's say you've looked through like 20 of these Nigel Short games and you thought this position was like critical. It was like interesting, but you don't know how good or bad it was. What you resort to next is step 4, analysis. And analysis is where you're going to try and figure out, like, you know, how good or bad was this position? What other options did Short have? You know, was bishop e3 any good? Was rook b1 any good? So now you just start playing moves, which Lee Chess is also going to let us do. You know, and now we're just trying out some moves and seeing how good or bad things go. Here, going after this. If I can just take it, my position looks pretty good. You can't just give pawns for nothing in the endgame here. So let's say this move. Man, this is awkward. You know, these moves aren't necessarily precise. We're just playing out some moves to find out what happens, you know? All right, so then you would like look at this and say, okay, is this good or bad position? I don't think white has achieved anything amazing. I mean, white's position's okay. It's nice that these pawns aren't next to each other. It makes it easier to sort of position white's pieces, right? So white's doing okay, but they don't seem to have achieved anything like super tremendous here, right? Yeah, I mean, you can do this with like a computer running if you want, but I suggest against it. It's just a bad habit. You'll just do more and more computer and become a weaker and weaker player. I could try, instead of going after d5, I could try doubling rooks here for white. Right, I could try this variation here. Seems like black can still play rook to b8. Let me switch over here. Play this, play this. Play this, play this. Now I've achieved something, right? This is like super annoying for black. I'm going to keep control of the B file, and having control of the B file is going to let me attack all of these things. They're not necessarily like super weak pawns, but like if my pieces are way more active, then they will become weak pawns. If your pieces get active enough, like everything your opponent has becomes a target. So, yeah, so this variation looks much better for white, right? So I like how this worked out, actually. I had thought of like bishop b4 here initially. This was my first thought, which I never even played because I'm sort of, you know, going through a bunch of moves and then picking out a couple to show you. This was my first thought, trying to like immediately put pressure on this and get the bishop active. But then I was just feeling like just so bad about this rook on f1. So then I tried playing king e2 first instead, and now prioritize the b file instead of the d file. And I love that now that black's played c4 because of my quick rook b5, I can play bishop e3 c5. I really like how this works because it looks at possibilities of winning this pawn, right? The reason I played a6 here for black was because I'm threatening for white rook b8, rook b8, rook b8, knight b8, bishop takes a7 with an outside pass pawn, right? So I played a6 and then just creeping in here. a5 is unnecessary. I wasn't threatening this, so that was just a loose move. You know, we can play rook c8 instead for black. you know, and we can play from here. But I like this. I like this use of the bishop, putting pressure on this, maybe coming here to get control of the b file. I feel like this is going kind of nicely for white. So that would be like the fourth part. That's just like a quick example of what the fourth part might look like, is then you like start to analyze some interesting position that you found and find out, you know, if you think it's any good. You know, you could also play rook b7 and not even bother with this rook to b5, right? You could get totally different positions if you went for rook b7 instead of rook b5. And here are ideas to play bishop e3 or bishop g5 or something. My guess is it's not as good, but who knows? I mean, I wonder if black can just get the rooks off really early here. Go for that. And then on this move, maybe even get away with knight d7. You know, and just hold solid like this. You know, and you can try out like a bunch of different moves. You can, this is also something you can do with friend, makes it better. My guess would be that, you know, we'll be going for rook b5 and then rook b1. I actually think we may have found the right approach in just a couple moments here. Yeah, I'll look into this creating a study idea. We want to see arrows too. Am I not showing you arrows? You don't see these guys? That's what I'm doing with the bishop. So yeah, so that's the fourth step, right? So step 3 is what we did here. You put in some variation, you play through these games here, right? And see, look, you can, maybe there's only 4 in this position. Yeah, I guess so. It says there's 22 with b6. So these are just the top games. So I don't know how to get it to display more than 4 games, but I imagine it could. If not, what you can do is you can go further down a branch, right? So you can be like, okay, we need to check b6 more because black has a good score in the b6 line, right? And now, you know, we're going to try, instead of c4 like short played, I want to try, you know, some other move that someone else played, like d takes c5. And now I've got 3 different games to look at, right? So Efemenko is a good player. You might want to look at his game. Bureev is a good player. So you'd want to look at these 2 games from 87 and 2004, right? So you click on this and play through it a little bit. I imagine he follows with c4, so it's going to be very similar to like the short Nogueras kind of thing. Again, queenside castling. There must be something to it, right? Well, that was a quick thing for white that worked out there. Interesting. You know, maybe like if this were to compare with the Nogueras game, Nogueras played this move, right? And then if you went c takes d5, bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, now you're back in the Nogueras short game. See, it pops back up. So this doesn't tell us that much extra because the move we'd be wondering about might be bishop a6, let's say. It could be similar. And then we can look at the Bureev game and see what Bureev did here. He kept the queens on the board, totally different approach. And now white thrashes with the queen on the king side. And achieves nothing, right? Loses a pawn. Hey Megash, welcome to the stream. All right. Okay, cool. I'll figure out how to do that. How to do this as a make a study. It's just probably a slightly complicated tool that I haven't used yet. So for today, this is enough new tools to be working on. So we see how that completely failed for white. And then you would say, you know, like if I ever get this position, I'm not flailing with my queen like this. You know, probably you want to trade before the bishop is here. And then the bishop has the other direction to go as well. So those are the 4 steps of learning and opening. Any questions about that before we move on from this segment? about the 4 steps for studying and learning an opening. I also miss my commentary on death matches. Death matches are extremely fun. I had a lot of other events I also wanted to do, but so it goes. I got to do one in December between Nakamura and Vaishela Graf. That was really fun. And then I did 2 in German earlier this year, which was also super fun. But yeah, I'd be happy to do more things like that. All right, go over the steps one more time, okay? So the first 2 steps both involve gathering your own ideas. In the first step, you look at the opening in question, the opening you're trying to learn, right? Whether it be like the French defense or the winnower. You look at the position and you try and think about it at a strategic level and try and understand what's going on, where things are going, and what you think are likely good and bad ideas. In the second step, that's the theoretical side of gathering your own ideas. In the second step, you go to the practical side of finding your own ideas, and you now play blitz games from both sides in the variations that you're interested in. And as I was saying, very often you'll have 2 variations you're interested in, like knight f3 or queen g4. So you try 2 different variations against the winnower and see which ones you like, which one seems to be more appealing to you. Same thing, you play it as black and as white, which one is more dangerous to you, etc. That's the first 2 steps. In the third step is getting other people's ideas, and that's usually in the form of going through Grandmaster games in a database, if you're so lucky. The second part of that could be talking to other players and getting their ideas. And if you want to practice a certain opening a bunch of times in a blitz game for step 2, an important thing I forgot to mention is that it's really, really helpful to have somebody who will agree to play that opening with you again and again and again, right? Because if you just go on playing like chess randomly, like one game someone plays knight f3, you don't get to practice the French. The next game someone plays d4, you don't get to practice the French. Then someone does play e4, you play the French, and they play like the exchange variation, and you're like, okay, not the most critical game, right? And then you get 4 more games without the French. So it can take a long, and you've got all your games with white. So it can take a very long time to get in 20 games practicing this variation of the Najdorf if you don't have a willing participant who wants to play 20 games in that same variation with you. So that can be very helpful for accelerating step 2, gathering your own practical ideas, is to find somebody who will play the same opening with you again and again, switching off colors, right? So then step 3, GM games. Step 3.b is talking to someone else about your ideas. And then step 4, which is optional for a non-professional player, for any amateur player. Option 4 is analysis. You've got some ideas that look promising to you, but now you want to try and work them out a little bit more precisely. Try out some variations that didn't come up in games and see what does or doesn't actually look good once you try out like tons of different moves. And just to be clear, a lot of people don't know this, analysis basically just means the trying of a ton of different moves, okay? So you just set up your position that you're interested in, and you try just move after move after move, different ones. All right. So those are the 4 steps, went over them again. And now we've got one more interesting question here. Should you choose the opening based on the mid game in which you feel more comfortable, or based directly on the end game? Which one would you choose? Or which one would I choose from my experience? Well, I mean, you have to take into account both middle games and end games that tend to arise from that opening. Some openings tend to have a lot of end games, like lead to end games more often, and other openings tend to lead more often to some kind of knockout or, decisive moment in the middle of the game. So, which one you weight more heavily depends on that, right? But in general, you're just kind of getting a sense of like all the likely positions from a particular variation and just deciding which one seems right to you. And sometimes you'll just play it even though you don't like the positions because you think it's the right move and you think eventually you're going to figure it out. Other times you'll play it because, that's the one that gives you positions that you actually think are good. At what level should you seek out chess coaches, David? I mean, a chess